Hello, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to Brookings, India. I'm D.Phil. I'm an associate fellow here under the Development Economics vertical. I welcome you all to today's event under the Gender Secretariat at Brookings, India. The Gender Secretariat serves as a platform for researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and academicians and other stakeholders to present, disseminate, and discuss ideas related to gender and inequality in India. So this platform seeks to better understand and document and foreground the existing inequalities that women face in various spheres, from health to financial inclusion to labor force participation and so on. The ultimate aim for this secretariat is to promote gender-responsive governance. And towards this goal, it facilitates, curates, and houses gender-related research and latest empirical evidence on these topics. Now, the existing research at Brookings, India has documented several issues under this theme. For example, the growing power of female voters across states in India, as well as the nature of female political participation. A recent paper also documents the extent of missing female patients in a large tertiary care public hospital. In the field of education, we have examined the aspirations of teenage girls and the impact it has on real outcomes like health and education. The topic for today's seminar under Gender Secretariat is unemployment and domestic violence. Our speaker is Professor Sonia Bhalotra. She's a professor of economics at the University of Essex. Professor Bhalotra's research focuses on topics of child development, gender and family economics, intergenerational mobility. She has published extensively on these topics. In her work, she has used microdata from several developing nations, the UK, the Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and so on. She is the co-investigator of the Economics and Social Research Council Center for Microsocial Change, as well as for the program on human rights, big data, and technology. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, a Krogh-Bergen Research Fellow, a research fellow at SFI Denmark. She is also a part of the steering group of the UNICEF-led Humanitarian Crisis and Adolescent Network. Professor Bhalotra will be presenting her recent work on male versus female job loss, income support, and domestic violence. Our panelist today is Advocate Indra Jaising. She'll be joining us shortly. She's a noted human rights lawyer and a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. She co-founded the Lawyers Collective, a legal NGO that has been working since its inception in 1980 for the rights of the economically and socially disadvantaged groups. Throughout her career, Advocate Jaising has worked tirelessly on women's rights, from the issues of dowry deaths to domestic violence. She has contributed towards the creation of the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act of 2005. In the past, she was elected to represent India to the United Nations on the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. She is also the first woman to be appointed the Additional Solicitor General of India. She will be talking about the legal aspects of domestic violence as part of today's discussion. Our other panelist is Anu Bhuyan. She is a journalist covering health policy and has reported on law and justice, technology, and society issues. She has studied conflict and development studies at SOAS, University of London. In 2018, she was awarded the Journalist of Change Award by Bournemouth University. She has previously worked at The Wire, BBC, Outlook Magazine, and National Public Radio. Anu will talk about the public health and the larger public policy perspective of the conversation. So, without further ado, I'll hand over the discussion to Professor Bhalotra to present her recent work. Professor Bhalotra.
Thank you very much for such a generous introduction. and thank you to everyone for coming to listen. I'm going to talk primarily about this one paper, which is actually set in Brazil. And the reason to focus on Brazil is it does have very high rates of domestic violence, but also it has unusually good data, better data than most European countries, and much better data than India. So it allows us to answer the question of interest in a more fine-grained manner. But I will briefly digress into talking about a published paper which uses demographic and health surveys for India and other developing countries, including many African countries. So there's an explicit statement about India, and then I will hope to have at least 5 or 10 minutes at the very end to tell you a little bit about a new project on sexual harassment in the workplace. And as that's quite topical, new, and there's very little research on it. So I'm an economist, though I work a lot with non-economists. This paper is joined with economists. They're both Brazilians. Paolo Pinotti, the third person, is Italian. This project is sort of supported by the Human Rights Big Data and Technology Project, which is a 5-year research center in Essex, where I work. Okay? So domestic violence is more widespread than we thought. There was a major UN, multi-UN center study coordinated by the World Health Organization that did use a similar questionnaire across many rich and poor countries, and came up with the unexpected finding that there isn't actually that much variation across countries. Women report being abused at some time in their life. That's different from the last 12 months, of course, but about 1/3 of all women in the world report being abused at some time in their lives. And that actually doesn't have a strong rich-poor country gradient. It's maybe 40 in Africa and 28 in Britain. The figures vary because data collection is very non-systematic, but it seems that anywhere between 38 and 60% of all female homicides are committed by an intimate partner. So the scale of the problem is large and it's very widespread. So this paper is specifically interested in how economic shocks affect domestic violence, and in particular how male and female unemployment matter, if they matter. And then in an extension we look at whether having unemployment benefits, which Brazil does have, mitigates any impact of unemployment. So we're going to use Brazilian administrative data, linking 2 sources of data. We have comprehensive court data. We have every court case for anything. It could be homicide, domestic violence, or sexual harassment, or abortion, anything that goes to court. For domestic violence, which is DV on the slides, there are 2 million cases over 9 years, so more than 200,000 a year. And of course, these are only the cases that go to court, and this is the tip of the iceberg. And when a case goes to court, it's a criminal case, because in the 2000s, Brazil criminalized domestic violence. So the plaintiff is typically a woman, and the defendant is a man. There are a few cases in the other direction, which are not in our data set. We throw them out. So we match this woman plaintiff to an employer-employee database that contains every employee in the formal sector. We don't have the informal sector in here. But formal sector includes quite small firms. So we link the plaintiff and the defendant. The defendant is the man. We link both to an employer-employee database by name. So the important thing is we know the employment status of both before and after the court case, and we use that. So when an individual is unemployed, male or female, it could be that there's something about them that is correlated with their proclivity or their tendency to commit domestic violence. So if we simply looked at a large data set and documented an association or a correlation of the two variables, unemployment and domestic violence, it could be spurious. It could be that a third factor, like poverty, leads to domestic violence and leads to unemployment, or several other possibilities. So what we really want is to generate causal estimates for which we need there to be some external reason outside the man's control that makes him unemployed. So we follow an established literature in economics that has used mass layoffs or plant closures. A mass layoff is defined in this literature as at least a third of the workforce of the firm being laid off all at once. And we vary that. We use a third, we use a half, we use the whole plant shut down. And no matter what we do, the results are quite similar, so this isn't going to be a sensitive point. The important thing is we use a mass layoff because it detaches the event of unemployment from anything the man did or any traits that he might have, such as, say, he's not conscientious or he's got a bad temper, that may lead him to be unemployed and lead him to commit domestic abuse. So that's how we address that challenge. There's another big challenge with this whole literature on sexual as in workplace or domestic violence, which is reporting bias. So firstly, you just underreport. For our purposes, as long as you don't underreport more when the man is unemployed, it's okay, there won't be a bias. There'll just be a level shift in reporting. But there's still a concern that the fact that the man is unemployed and therefore less worthwhile to the woman might make her more likely to report. That would again make what we find spurious. So we deal with that by a few methods. I'll just highlight the best one, which is in Brazil. The data are very detailed, and you know a lot about the incident. So certain cases are what the Brazilians call, or the Italians call, il flagrante, which basically means caught in action. So if you're caught in action by the neighbor or the police, then the reporting doesn't come into it. So we repeat the analysis for those cases and the results are similar. So this is all so far just about trying to get causal estimates that aren't biased. And then we're going to use the fact that Brazil has an unemployment insurance or benefit system, and that there's a discontinuity in whether you can apply for it. So basically, if you've been unemployed before, there needs to have been a 16-month gap at least between the last time you were unemployed and this time for you to be eligible. So if the gap is 15 months, you're not eligible. If it's 16, you're eligible. And the profile of people who are 15 or 16 months from their last layoff is not very different. So this is what economists or statisticians call a regression discontinuity. You get a sudden sharp change in whether or not you're eligible depending on months since the last layoff around this threshold of 16. And so we use that as well, as it gives you a natural experiment to see whether whatever effects we find of unemployment are mitigated or lessened by having this benefit. And that clearly is interesting for policy reasons. And then finally, so I didn't say first, but we look at male unemployment primarily, but we also look at female unemployment. The data are worse, but we look at it. And then we put it all together, the male, the female unemployment, the unemployment benefits, and we say, given this confluence of three relationships that we've identified, what could the theoretical model be that's explaining the pattern, the overall pattern? So there's already a literature on domestic violence. It's very mixed discipline. My co-author made these slides, so I didn't put my paper first. He did. But the first paper there is the one that includes India, so I will digress on it a little bit. India doesn't have the court data, or not available to me, or the employee database at the individual level, but it does have repeated cross-sections from the demographic and health surveys, which tell you if the man and woman are employed at the time of survey, and tell you if the woman is reporting domestic abuse. And because they're repeated cross-sections, we have 4 now, the DHS surveys, you can generate for each year of the survey whether unemployment was above or below its own trend. The unemployment series are continuous, so you can calculate an unemployment shock as being plus or minus or big or small, coincident with the DHS survey. So we use this pooling countries, and we also isolate India, but it's similar in India and Africa. And we ask a very similar question: how do male versus female unemployment rate shocks affect the prevalence of domestic violence? And we find that male unemployment increases domestic violence. And we explain this in terms of psychological or financial stress. You're unemployed, you're in a bad mood, and you commit violence. However, we get what looks like an unexpected result for female unemployment, which is that it's the opposite. When the woman is unemployed, there's less domestic violence. It's easier to see this if I just flip it around to saying that if women's, remember the unemployment rate is a market rate, not her unemployment. So if employment opportunities improve for women, then it increases violence. And we explain this in terms of male backlash. And then we did a literature search, and we found quite a large cluster, I wasn't aware of the number of studies, in very different settings in Africa, India, of evidence of male backlash. So when men feel threatened because there's a male breadwinner norm, and female unemployment relative to male unemployment is looking good, in other words, female opportunities are in relative terms expanding, this threatens the man and increases violence. So the policy implications, I should jump to that. The policy implications of that for India are, well, for male unemployment, they're simply trying to address male unemployment, which has its own purpose, is also good for domestic violence. If you have unemployed men, try to get them into work more quickly, because it'll also help domestic violence. With female unemployment, there are lots of programs in India and elsewhere that are aimed at either training women to be skilled and employable, or giving them capital, or just giving them jobs, including NREGA. And so it's just awareness that female empowerment programs that make women economically viable could, in the short term, lead to this reaction from men. And so I guess the policy response is to be aware and to try and anticipate these effects, and have community-based services that can work against them. Then there's, I also need to tell you what the developed countries find, because it's basically the opposite. So in the US and the UK, there's a complete sign reversal for the male and female unemployment rates. In the UK and the US, when men are unemployed, they're tamed into being well-behaved. And the reason is that there's a threat of the woman leaving. And so if they're unemployed, they have to behave well, because she has an incentive to leave. And conversely, it's symmetric. If the female is unemployed, her outside options are less good, so she's more likely to suffer violence. And they found this using, in a study published just last year, using neighborhood level crime data for Britain. So in our paper, using Indian and African data, we found a recently published index of the ease with which a woman, relative to a man, can access divorce. Those could be cultural or legal or financial costs. The OECD has counted that all in and created an index which does vary across developing countries. And we find that the average behavior I just described for India, which is the opposite to the relationships for Britain, is because access for women cultural and legal to divorce is more limited than in Western countries. But for those developing countries where access is equal, the results become very similar to the results for OECD countries. So whether or not the woman has outside options seems to play a key role. Yeah, I won't go through all the other pieces of the literature. Okay, so because I'm focusing more on policy and results, and I want to get to the other talk, the main point I want you to take away from this slide is that the studies I've just described, including my own, that included India, and the US and UK studies, this whole literature, are using the regional unemployment rate. It's a market rate, and so it's reflecting job opportunities. However, when there's a recession or there's an upturn in unemployment rates, often other things change. Maybe the state, like in India, maybe the state has to cut back on public expenditure because the state also suffers the fiscal strain of recession. But in the US and the UK, at least the UK, maybe the opposite. The state tries to compensate for recession by increasing welfare-based transfers. And various other things happen, other types of crime, like property crime goes up. So the problem with any area level shocks is that there could be confounders. So within the statistical literature, it's reasonably established that it's much more precise and less biased if you can use individual job loss, but it has to be individual job loss that happens by accident, such as by a mass layoff or a plant closure, not because you were a poor worker. So we use that mass layoffs experiment in the Brazilian data. So in Brazil, since 2006, with the passage of what is called the Maria da Penha law, which was really quite revolutionary. Maria da Penha is a woman who was really severely beaten up by her husband, and finally he tried to shoot her, and he managed to injure her enough that she's in a wheelchair today, and she has spearheaded. There are many women's rights movements in Brazil. Brazil is actually a lot like India. It's richer, but there are so many similarities. It's very macho. There's a big women's rights civil society movement, but it seems to me, Indira will correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me well ahead of India in terms of legislative interventions. So since 2006, there is a really impressive series of initiatives to address domestic violence. It's criminalized. There's what's called a no-drop policy, which basically means that if a woman reports to the police, or let me go back one step, there are women-only police stations, similar to India. India has them as well, but they're not very widespread. So first they opened women-only police stations to improve reporting. Then they introduced a no-drop policy, which means that once a woman reports to the police, even if she gets cold feet or just makes a wise judgment not to have her husband incriminated, she cannot withdraw the case. It jumps from the police to the prosecutor, and from the prosecutor to the judge, and it's more or less out of her hands. So quite a lot of cases do progress to court. Of course, it's not perfect. Once it goes to court, she's called as a witness, and then she may not come as a witness, and the case may be dropped. So it's not as good as it sounds, but at least they're trying. So anyway, DV cases, domestic violence cases, today represent 11% of all criminal cases. And this is a country with one of the, I think it's the 7th highest rate of violent crime. It's a very violent country, homicide and knifing and so on. So that's quite a lot of cases. And 55% are assault and battery, which we normally think of as physical violence. But Brazil does actually count threats, like I'll kill you could take a man to court. So 15% are just threats. And in our data, 50% are current partners, and another 15% are previous partners, the perpetrators. So what I think is really has huge potential and can't be done, say, for Britain or India, but could be done for Brazil, is what I mentioned briefly at the start. We can find the name of the individual plaintiff in the court case and the individual defendant, and link this man and woman into an employee database where we track them for 10 years. So if the case is in 2006, we know what their employment was doing in 2004-05, and also after the case. And this is the whole country, and it's a big country like ours. And so we have a very rich laboratory with 100 million workers and 10 million layoffs each year. And these are the instruments we're going to use. So, so there is judicial secrecy, and this leads to some cases, especially cases of rape or cases of minors being involved, not having the name in the file. So we do lots of tests, which I won't detail, but we try to check for whether the representativeness of our sample, because of missing data, is changing the results. And we find that however we cut the data, we get quite stable results. This is about the missing data. This is about the matching. Okay, so the methodology is essentially what statisticians call difference in difference, or event study designs, where you have an event and you look at the trajectory of the outcome before and after the event. The outcome here is domestic violence, and what you're testing is, does domestic violence jump up or jump down after men are laid off their jobs? And we have, so that's a bit complex. We don't really need a control group because we've got a natural experiment through the mass layoff. But those of you who are economists, I'll just quickly say there's a very new literature critiquing DID when the events are staggered over time, saying that the main effect might be confounded with heterogeneity in effects over time, dynamic effects. So for that, it's helpful to have a control group. So we construct this matching very finely the type of the income of the worker. So we have a worker who looks just like you, who wasn't laid off, but you were laid off. Okay, so that's what the model looks like, and we control for municipality times industry times year fixed effects. So this is the main result in a picture. It's not a raw graph, it's conditioned out municipality, industry, and time multiplicatively. And what you see is the zero is in this sort of setup, the event. So it's the layoff. Zero is the year in which a man gets laid off. For man A, it might be 2006. For man B, it might be 2009. But we collapse the year of layoff into this item called year zero. So years before zero on the left are showing you pre-trends, what happened before the layoff and what happened after. And you see that domestic violence is really quite flat. Nothing's happening for the first 3 years till -1. And then in the year zero, sorry, I said the wrong thing. Domestic violence is the next slide. This is the first stage. This is just showing you, this is employed. This is showing you when there's a mass layoff, there's a big drop in employment. It's just verifying what in English was implicit, that a layoff means employment falls. So it's a big drop in employment, as the title says. The next graph looks just like it, but is reversed. DV goes up. So this is domestic violence, pooling two measures of violence in the court data, which are prosecution and protective measures. And if you add them up, you see that until year -1, domestic violence cases are hovering around the zero line. And then It's a normalization. It's just saying that there's not much change. And then as you go from year -1 before the layoff to year 0, which is the year of the layoff, there's a sharp jump, which is statistically significant in the incidence or risk of domestic violence. And this jump persists. It's not just the year after layoff, it persists for at least 4 years after layoff. So the message, this is the main result in the paper, then we do 100 checks and subcategories and so on. But the main message is that men who are laid off or unemployed for no fault of their own, that's how we construct the layoff variable, just because that sector is declining, those men commit more domestic violence. And these, so the first, it goes only 1 minute. The first graph has prosecution and protective, and then the next 2 graphs separate them, and you see that we get the same result for prosecution and protective. Right at the bottom of the slide is the percentage increase. So prosecution cases increased by 37%, and protective measure cases increased by 31%. This is a table showing you the same result as in the figure, using a regression, and also showing you robustness to doing different things, taking all displaced workers, taking only displaced workers in mass layoffs, and then adding these very strong controls. And none of this matters. Whatever you do, you get this result, and the magnitude is quite similar. This is robustness to missing values. So if you're a statistician, you would wonder if the cases where the woman doesn't want to give her name, for example, maybe they're the most severe cases. And if you take them out of your sample, you're not saying something representative of all women who go to court. So we do this variation where we let the share of missing cases vary from 25% right up to 90%. And the estimates we show you there, the 61, the 42, they're not statistically different from each other if you look at the standard errors. This is now varying the definition of a mass layoff, varying whether we include small firms or big firms, because I want to move on to questions of more policy interest. I'm just saying, as somebody who does a lot of statistical work, these are remarkably robust results. One reason is that we have millions of people in there, so all these cuts still give you a very large sample in which the average behavior seems not to be very sensitive to these variations. Okay. So there's a concern that unemployed men are less attractive to their partners. So suppose he's been hitting her all this time. He gets unemployed, he hits her, and now she won't take it. So she goes to court. It's called endogenous reporting or reporting bias. She goes to court and reports to the police first, and reports because he's unemployed. In that case, this relationship would be spurious. So I said this very briefly when at least Indira wasn't here. One handle we have on this potential problem is that Brazil has a category of cases which is called il flagrante cases, which in Latin just means caught in action. So if you're caught in action, reporting doesn't come into the picture. Also, we then just did some guesstimating that younger couples will be less tied. They may not have children. We could actually find out, but we haven't done that, but we just took their age. They will just be less tied because they've been together less. They may not have children. So we thought that the younger people might report more. And if reporting was the main action, reporting bias, then we would see a different age gradient. And lastly, if you're thinking, should I report, should I not, you're on the cusp. It makes sense that you should be on the cusp for the less intense cases. If the man is about to kill you, you have nothing to lose, you report. But if he's not so bad, he always apologizes, maybe you don't report. So we looked at, so Brazil has everything, it's amazing what they collect. they have gradation of severity. And we can look at whether after these layoffs, what we're finding is only in the less severe cases. And I will show you the slides, but before I blur you with more tables, let me just tell you that the age profile doesn't match reporting bias. The court inaction cases show a strong result, which cannot be reporting, and the very severe cases, including murder, show a result. So there are more homicides, or there are more deaths of women by their partners after layoff. So it's not reporting. This is the severity data. This is the type of crime. For example, it's across the board. You can see what Brazil collects, slander, threatening, battery, severe assault, ordinary assault, limiting your freedom. All of them, each of them is responding to male unemployment. So then we stop the clock there for a moment, and we now ask a new question, which is whether female unemployment affects domestic violence. And I told you in the introduction that when you look in India and Brazil, the effects of male unemployment are similar, but the effects of female unemployment are not. So in Brazil, female unemployment also increases domestic violence. In India, it seems to assuage demand and decreases it. And this cross-country study I did suggests that the reason is that access to divorce for women in India is harder than in Brazil. So we did exactly the same strategy, but using women who were laid off in mass layoffs or plant closures, and we find a similar result. The reason the increase looks so big, it's 73% instead of 37%. You shouldn't read too much into it. The percentage is always bigger when the base is smaller. So it's a very large, significant effect. So yeah, again, we cut the data in different ways, adjust for missing data, change all the stuff we did before to show you that the result is robust. Okay. And now is something more interesting for policy. So Brazil has an unemployment benefit, and it's for 3 to 5 months after you're laid off. You get 80% of your previous wage. That's actually higher than in many countries in Europe, though it's shorter. 3 to 5 months, 80%. So it can be quite valuable. And we looked at whether, it depends on what the reasons for DV, domestic violence, are, but if it was income stress, then unemployment benefits should lessen the effect. And before we show you the results, so we look at unemployment benefit for men. We could do it for women, but we haven't because it's second order. Before I show you the results, I'll tell you what they are. So it's simple, which is it misfires. So in the first months, there's nothing. It makes no difference. But after the man has been unemployed for a year, in the second year, so he's reached the second year of unemployment, the benefits have ceased. He had them, but they've ceased because they're max 5 months. Then he's more likely to commit violence. At first glance, I couldn't see why this would be true, but we've backtracked to an economics literature, which shows, for example, in the US and everywhere, that in general, when men get unemployment benefits, or women, when people get unemployment benefits, even if they're for a short duration, the time they take to get back to work is longer. It helps their skills to depreciate, or they become lazy, or the benefit's good enough that they can get by, we don't know. But it's a common result that if you have an unemployment benefit for 6 to 12 months, anywhere in the world, the time till you return to work tends to lengthen. So the way we're rationalizing this, we do lots of tests, which I don't have time to explain. So I'll just tell you our best guess or our best deduction from research. is that it's what sociologists or criminologists have called exposure. The man is at home a lot, and the unemployment benefit increases the chances he's at home, and that's why the violence goes up. But we can't prove that, that's a hunch, by elimination. But what we can eliminate is that it's income stress. So it's not income stress, it's either this having the man at home. And I actually said to my co-author, who's Brazilian, that I think it's a bit far-fetched that it goes up so much just because he's at home. Because if he's a violent type, he could commit violence in the evening after work. And my co-author said, I also thought maybe it's far-fetched, but I was in a taxi yesterday, this is like last month, in Brazil, and without my co-author bringing it up, the taxi driver said something, I'm forgetting now the exact conversation, but the taxi driver joked and said something about how he better not go home early or he might hit his wife, or he might be tempted to hit his wife. So this is what we're finding in Brazil, that unemployment benefits do not help. There's this quite fancy regression discontinuity using the eligibility criterion at the 16-month gap period, which I described at the start. And there's these tests of balance across that discontinuity. All of this just should help convince you that we did the research as accurately as we could to make sure these were causal effects and not accidental associations. Now, if I have 5 minutes, I would like a lot to talk to you about sexual harassment, just to expose you to the data and idea. So we then look at all the mechanisms, rule out income, and lean towards exposure. And we're doing more work. So is sexual harassment up? So I sent 2 PDFs, and the next lot was sexual harassment. Oh, we have, no? Even this morning I resent them, or last night. I think I always send 2 sets of slides. They're 2 separate PDFs though. Although if it'll take a long time I could talk, but there's some very pretty graphs. No? Well, I'll start talking so that we don't run over. So it's the same co-authors, minus the Italian Paolo, but the 2 Brazilians and I. And we are using the same source data, except that instead of criminal law cases, we've got labor law cases, which is a different file. And we see every sexual harassment case, workplace sexual harassment case that goes to court. And here the plaintiff is a woman or a man, the victim, and the defendant is the firm. We don't know the perpetrator, we know the firm because it's a labor case. So the firm has to pay up for workplace harassment. The penalties vary a lot, but they can be quite stiff. So it's quite large stakes for the firm. So we have 2 research questions. Our first research question, which is related to the big question of why women don't report. So the whole Me Too movement, which has drawn so much attention, is rooted in the fact that women have not been talking about workplace harassment, that it's much more common than we think. A survey for Britain, I find it hard to believe, but it's there. There's a survey for Britain saying 52% of women say that they have felt harassed. It could be, it doesn't have to be physical, it could be feeling harassed. And something like between 20 and 50 in the US, depending on the survey. So it's quite big, and there's a major problem with all cases of violence against women that they don't want to report because of possible backlash. So in the case of domestic violence, you saw I discussed that in India there appears to be backlash, but of a different nature. But with sexual harassment, I think whether you're in Britain or in India, the concern is that if you report, you might be fired, or they'll find another excuse to fire you in a few months, or you might just be hated, or basically your career might suffer as well. But if you do report, the firm could suffer. The penalties are quite big in Brazil. It's a very pro-labor legislative environment. And so what we tried to do, which I think has not been done anywhere, and is very hard to do for many reasons I can describe, is to measure the career costs to the woman after she reports, and to measure how the firm declines or doesn't decline after she reports. So first we looked at the firm. We did two things. In this employer-employee data, we don't have profits. It's a labor data set. But we do have the gender composition of the firm and its size, which is just number of employees. And we find that following, so for sexual harassment cases going to court, we have the date it's filed and the date of the sentence. And I'm telling you now about the date it's filed, not the sentence. That's another paper. Okay. So after the filing of a case, the firm shrinks, and it's coming mostly from smaller firms. The big firms are quite immune, and the gender composition moves in favor of women, and especially women managers. They seem to go for more women managers. And with the individuals, the woman who reports suffers career damage that doesn't recover for the 4 years that we allow in our sample. So she really suffers career damage, and it lasts 4 years. The third question, which is possibly the most interesting, which we haven't analyzed yet, is the woman who reports suffers, but do the women who stay back in the firm, do they benefit because she reported? Because that's the wider social benefit of reporting. So we have actually kind of paused ourselves on this paper. I wanted to present it today, so I don't want this to go in the press without the caveat that in the domestic violence paper I presented, I'm confident that the fact of the man becoming unemployed is an event. It's not something he chooses to do. However, when the woman reports sexual harassment, she's making a choice. Some women report, some don't, and they can choose when to report in the whole process. So the date of reporting and whether she reports could be related to what was happening in her life. So for example, she may have been on a rising trajectory. Some man in the office may be envious, committed harassment, and then she reports. But the thing is, her trajectory was rising. Or the opposite. She may have been, for some reason, not doing very well at work. And in Brazil, labor law is very pro-labor. So if you file a case, your chances are quite good. It's very cynical, but it's possible.
It's up now.
Okay.
Graph.
So it's possible that she reports because she's on a decline. So my main point is we get these really striking results, but there's a caveat that there may not be fully causal. I think the association is still interesting, and I won't say, because I don't want to overtake too much of your time, we try to deal with it. We have what for the economists are individual fixed effects, matched workers, but we do matching and differencing to try and get rid of this previous trend, but these results could possibly fall short of being causal. So I have to do Control L somehow with this. Okay. So these were just the 3 questions: whether the firm suffers, whether the reporting person, the victim suffers, and whether other women benefit. We think that we can get the most causal answer to the third question, which I'm afraid we just haven't got to. Everybody's been busy. But the first 2, we get striking results, and we have the caveat that they may be only correlations. So the Me Too movement brings sexual harassment into focus. There's no systematic time series data on it for any country, which makes it hard to conduct either research or policy, but it seems high from scattered surveys. These are the 3 research questions. There's this literature, which I guess I shouldn't elaborate, no? We don't have time. Okay. This I thought, it's not my work, I just pasted it from The Economist magazine. So these are 6 very specifically known firms like Nike. They had sexual harassment cases against them in 2018, and 2 weeks later, their stock market prices declined. So one of the things we've already done is to generalize this, taking the millions of firms we have in Brazil for all firms, and then separating the publicly listed ones. So for publicly listed firms, we manually matched in stock market prices by the day over time to see if we can replicate this, and we don't. So in Brazil, the big firms don't suffer any stock market decline. So it's the same amazing data linking every court case to every labor record. Similar event study design. One interesting thing in this data is that 30% of sexual harassment cases going to court has a male victim. I'm surprised, but it's there. Maybe men are more likely to go to court, but 30% have a male victim. And this helps us to get closer to a causal effect, because if what I said before about pre-trends being a concern was driving our results, it should hold for men as well. But when we look at the individual's career, we see individual women victims suffer a career cost after reporting, and men don't, or much less. It's significantly less. So I want to show you. So this is the result, that firms become less. This active firm just means you exist. So some firms exit. The small ones, they just die. I have to say, this result is so striking. It's what started us thinking that maybe there's something else going on. We do think that these firms were declining anyway. And this is like, it's possible that a declining firm gets more cases. I still think it's all very interesting. When do people report? Maybe they're more likely to report when they know their job is at stake anyway. They have nothing to lose. They were going to be laid off, so they report. So this is with a pinch of salt, but it's data. That's what the data show. This is the number of employees shrinking. This, I think, is a robust result because it's a ratio. So even if something is not causal, it should cancel out in the numerator and denominator. So you see, after the case is filed, the share of women employees who are managers goes up. So it seems firms respond to try to improve the environment for those who the firms that survive. This is the result for, it's a bit hard to read, and there's some details about how this graph is drawn that I'm really not telling you. So maybe I should leave you with the statement that this result, if you compare really, the rest are confidence intervals. If you compare the black and the grey line, they tell you how the difference between the career paths of women who do and don't file a SH case, and the women who file do worse. But if you look instead in terms of earnings, if you look instead at men, which will come in a minute, the black and grey lines coincide, telling you that men who file cases are no different in their income paths after filing than men who don't file cases. So this was, I'll just say one more word about the future, and then I'll stop. Sorry. So the last thing I'll say is that because we're conscious that reporting could be endogenous or the result of something already happening in the firm, we're now we're web scraping the actual case. The case is a long document with lots of sentences. So what we have so far is data. We're web scraping with 5 or 6 PhD students every sexual harassment judgment with the full story of what she said, what the judge said, what the sentence was. And we're going to look at 3 things, which is basically for the cases that are that a judgment is passed on, how does the judgment itself, whether the woman, the plaintiff, man or woman, wins the case or loses the case, affect their future parts? What is the role of the gender of the judge? Are female judges more pro-female? And also, what is the role of the race of the victim? Because Brazil has a fair fraction of black people, and there will not be black judges, so we can't look at the race of the judge. Judges are predominantly white, but we can look at the race of the victim.
All right. Thank you, Professor Bhalotra. That was a wonderful presentation. So I'll open the floor to the panelists now. So Advocate Jessing, if you could shed some light on the legal aspect of domestic violence. Yeah. Here.
Use that? Yeah. Sure, I'm happy to shed some light on the legal aspects of domestic violence. Though I'm not aware of any study done in India which links employment and unemployment with domestic violence, but nevertheless, there are commonalities within laws. So there is a sharp distinction between the civil remedies for domestic violence and the criminal remedies for domestic violence in India. And the criminal remedy for domestic violence has existed since 1984. And it came into existence mainly because of the issue of so-called dowry deaths, of women dying in the matrimonial home, which by any definition would be a crime, but which were not recognized as such. The police were closing these cases as quote-unquote accidental, and it was only, mainly in the kitchen. Women are supposed to die in the kitchen while attending to cooking. And it was not until 2005 that we got a law on domestic violence in India. And this law was specifically conceived of as a civil law, also a law which could give protection orders. So it's considered a very, very important landmark in the journey for gender justice in India, because it for the first time defines what is domestic violence against women. Until then, we had no definition except a catch-all phrase of cruelty in section 498A of the Indian Penal Code. But to deconstruct the word cruelty, it was specified that whether it's economic violence or sexual violence, or even for that matter, emotional violence, it would be considered violence under the law. And the kind of remedies that could be granted were a restoration of the woman to what we call the shared household, and compensation, monthly payments, all directed against the offending partner. There was a provision for recognizing live-in relationships, so it wasn't confined to married couples alone. But the peculiarity of the Indian joint family system had to be taken on board, because the nuclear family still is not the norm. We still have the joint family, and therefore the violence could emanate either from the partner or from the parent-in-law. And there is definitely this kind of sociological response that it's the mother-in-law who oppresses the daughter-in-law. So all those factors had to be taken into consideration at the stage of drafting the law. Now, coming to issues like how successful the law has been and how successful it has not been. One of the reasons for drafting it as a civil law was the fact that women were reluctant to report criminal law. They were reluctant to access criminal law. There was actually a reluctance that they don't want to send their spouses to jail. And my study of the international situation brought me to the same conclusion, that there is a similar concern in different parts of the world. In fact, whether it's the Maria Dupin law or whether it was the case, the Fernandez case in the United States, where the father put 3 children in the dicky of his car, killed all of them, and then went to the police station and surrendered himself, all indicate that legal intervention comes after the violence is complete. And very often the violence is so severe that it leads to death. So at the stage of drafting, we looked at several policies, like no-drop policies. We looked at what would work in the Indian situation, what would not work. And of course, the overarching conclusion was that criminal law doesn't seem to be working to the extent that it is required to work. And we also found that most spouses had found ways and means of beating the criminal law. One of the biggest myths that has been constructed in relation to all laws is the business of women misuse the law. And it really has a chilling effect on women bringing cases to court. This is true whether it's domestic violence or whether it's sexual harassment at the workplace. And we are still struggling with that issue. I don't think we've quite found a solution. I think the main concern that women have in India is, one is economic, and the other is a displacement from the residence. Housing is a very big issue for them when they face violence, and so the law particularly tried to focus on this issue, and perhaps for the first time in Indian legal history created a right for women to reside in what we call the shared household. It just simply did not exist before. There was no recognition of any such right. So what I'm trying to say is that the legal status of women in India is extremely fragile and tenuous still today. There's no overarching law which defines the economic rights of women within a marriage, whether it subsists or whether it breaks down. And that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest factors which leads to domestic violence in India, in intimate spaces. Your conclusion also seems to suggest that it's not enough to empower women by providing them with employment, and what one has to look at is a very comprehensive change in social norms. Obviously, respect for men and women, between in intimate relationships, and I think the question of reforming a lot of our marriage laws is very important. Reforming custodial rights of respective spouses, reforming the divorce law, reforming property laws. Again, all these laws are very linked to, in India, the whole issue of religion, because different religions look at different laws very differently. But yes, there are a few bottom lines, and one of them is the welfare of the children, which cannot be compromised. A lot of disputes have arisen over that issue. What exactly does it mean? The issue of cross-country marriages has been a very, very big issue because it raises issues of jurisdictions in courts, and does all these issues, by the way, do impact employment. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And but on the question of access, I think the domestic violence law has been a success story. They have been accessing the domestic violence law a lot more than they ever accessed 498A. So I would say, and there is also a pattern in access. If a woman has come to the conclusion there's a trigger that the marriage is broken down and there's no point in going back to this marriage, she will access the criminal law. But if she thinks that there is scope for reconciliation, then she's not going to access the criminal law. And I personally believe that the choice should be with her. I actually have my doubts about the no-drop policy. And I would say the equivalent about the no-drop policy in the field of child sexual abuse has been the issue of mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. And a lot of people who work in the health sector do not agree with mandatory reporting. Again, perhaps for the same reason, because a lot of sexual abuse happens within intimate relationships as well. And also because the law has nothing to offer them beyond a prosecution. There are no support services. So very often women think, at the end of the day, all right, we prosecute, but what then? What next? What is my status after the prosecution? I'm left without hearth and home. My husband has no employment, my partner has no employment, there's no one to look after my children. And so I found reluctance even to report child sexual abuse among mothers, which of course was very shocking to me. Because I may not agree with mandatory reporting by third parties. There was a slight mention of your third party reporting there. But I would believe that child sexual abuse by a father does require to be reported. But the question is that, who do they report to? Do they report to the police, or should there be a separate channel for reporting, which would be like a social service channel for reporting, where the idea is to document the abuse and to ensure that the abuser is monitored throughout the period of rehabilitation, or call it what you like. I do believe that child sexual abuse should be prosecuted. I don't think it can be left purely to the civil domain. But I'm a bit confused about how this is going to happen and what the consequences are going to be for the women. And I believe that there should be these parallel tracks which are available, where a woman should be able to move between the parallel tracks at her choice and depending on her threshold of ability to move forward. Because right now she simply doesn't have the ability to move forward. I dealt with a case quite recently of a 10-year-old who was raped by her father. And if that wasn't enough, she got pregnant. And the pregnancy was discovered at a very late stage. And it was only the intervention of the Supreme Court which made it possible to address this issue, because the pregnancy has reached a stage at which it was suggested that it would be dangerous to carry out an abortion. And the court had to constitute a medical board. But apart from that, I then insisted, but you'll be surprised, I hope you're alarmed to know that the child actually was born. And then we had a situation and we had to deal with the rights of two children. The mother was a child and the child who was born was a child. So the prosecution, of course, was fast-tracked and there was a conviction. But what I insisted upon was a monitoring of the mother, and I obtained a court order by which I was able to get this child back into school. She was still studying. So all those factors became very important. What do you do with a 10-year-old who has given birth to a child? What do you do with a 10-year-old who's had to drop out of school? How do you ensure that she gets back into school? Obviously, there are health consequences for a 10-year-old who's given birth to a child. And so the only solution that I could offer at that stage was that the court monitors the progress of this mother till she attained majority. So from the age of 10 to the age of 18, I said she has a right to all kinds of benefits from the state, which will enable her to get back into the mainstream of life. And I didn't ever meet the child. I didn't want to infringe her privacy. But on reading her responses, she was provided counseling. I came to the conclusion that she was a relatively, she seemed to know what she wanted because she insisted on going back to the same school. We offered her a change of school, but she insisted on going back to the same school. Anyway, the other policy in India that's much debated and is likely to be debated in future is the issue of mandatory registration of sex offenders. that again is very, very problematic, whereas I can see the benefits of that to prevent repeat victimization or re-victimization either of the same person, or because this phenomenon does exist, you do have repeat victimization of the same victim. And that's part of the reason why we say don't let them out on bail. But the question is, of course, they've undergone sentence and then they're out, and they could become a threat to other women as well. And that's why mandatory registration of sex offenders is a policy which India is considering very seriously, and I think it's already introduced to some extent. But world over, there's a lot of literature to suggest that mandatory registration of sex offenders can also be very harmful in terms of being able to have a reformative approach, or to be able to rehabilitate people and kind of bring about some kind of reconciliation, not at the individual level, but at least at the social level and at the policy level. So these are some of the issues that we are grappling with at the moment, over and above the issue of domestic violence. I've already said that no drop policy, I'm aware of it, but it may not work, given that there's one issue that we were very careful at the time of drafting the law, and that was the whole issue of conciliation and reconciliation during the period of domestic violence. Now, we wanted to make sure that there was no attempt at reconciliation while the domestic violence was still going on, and we put it into the law that she must first be given a protection order before any reconciliation is effected. I do not think the courts are following that trajectory. They are pretty much ignoring it. In the United States, more particularly the work of Catherine McKinnon, I have noticed that normally a person who brings an action to court, it's only after the employment contract ends. And it's only after, and the remedy then is in the form of compensation, maybe heavy monetary damages. So the last thing I want to say, in India, there is a peculiar inability to award monetary compensation to women who would prefer not to continue in employment, or those who have been sacked. Both on the part of the court, and there is as far as I can see, I personally encourage a lot of women to seek compensation, but they turn around and tell me, Ms. Jessing, we don't want to be seen, again, the perception issue, and which is very serious, very severe, and they say we don't want to be seen as women who have brought a complaint only to get money out of a guy, a man. And that becomes a huge inhibitor of getting any relief which I would consider to be a relief which is just. I believe that there should be hefty compensation, monetary compensation, in the case of sexual harassment at the workplace. But there are inhibitors to this, both from the employer, for obvious reasons, and from the woman herself. And some of the women who have claimed compensation have then gone on to make statements like, even if we get the money, we'll donate it to somebody, we're not going to keep it for ourselves, and because they're so terribly concerned about so compensation doesn't seem to be a remedy, though it should be. It could be a deterrent as much as criminal law. And finally, on the question of what happens to the stock of the company when you complain, I've noticed that it has been easier for me to negotiate settlements with multinational companies than it is for companies which are purely domestic. They seem to care more about their international image and their reputation, though this is not entirely true. Some of the most celebrated cases in India, which are unresolved till today, are against multinationals. And when it comes to multinationals, we do have problems with jurisdiction, because the first thing they do is they deny the jurisdiction of the Indian court, and too many women can't be expected to file suits in the United States of America or any other country in the world. But on the other hand, I have been able to settle cases against multinationals on behalf of women clients. There was one case in particular which was against a multinational headquartered in the USA, and the moment the complaint was made, the head of HR and the head of legal department actually flew down to Delhi and requested a meeting with me because I was the lawyer. And it didn't take much to convince them that this was a case of sexual harassment. And the complaint was against the chief executive officer of the company, who was very, very highly connected, as well as enjoyed a very high position in the company. But they dealt with it, and they made sure that the woman got what she was asking for. The only problem I noticed in that case was that she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So again, it didn't quite end in kind of major policy changes for the establishment, though of course everybody in the establishment knew who the complaint was against and what it was all about. I haven't been able to go back to that company and try to find out whether other women benefited from this whole exercise or not. But on the other hand, it was an experience which was worth recounting, because the way in which the seriousness with which they took the issue was very refreshing. And among all the cases that I have handled against Indian companies, I haven't encountered a single one who has handled it with the same. Thank you for your study.
Thank you so much for sharing your legal perspective. Anu, so I'd like you to share your perspective on the ramifications that domestic violence has on the greater public health issue and, of course, the health and education of children. You have some experience working in the public health sphere.
Hi, good evening. I'm not sure if I can answer those, speak to those exact questions, but I'll just, I guess, share some thoughts that were on my mind during this. I mostly cover public health, also cover other stuff. In India, we, for example, don't legally acknowledge the presence of marital rape. And there's a case going on that in the Delhi High Court, whether marital rape exists or should be allowed to exist. But we have some data that gives us a clue on marital rape, and that actually comes from the Family and Health Survey data, where women are asked about what kind of violence and sexual violence they face within marriages. So they're not asked specifically about whether it could be rape, but they're asked about violence and sexual violence within marriage, and that's collected as part of health data. So I think I appreciate this forum. I appreciate that we're discussing a working paper and not, something that's already out. I appreciate that there's I as a journalist have the opportunity to interact with a lot of you as academics, because I mean, as a journalist, sometimes it feels like these are two different worlds. So also disclosure on my part, I'm not an academic at all. That's probably, I couldn't do it. That's why I'm probably here as a journalist. So I may not fully understand, some of where you all are coming from, maybe some of the methodologies you use. So excuse, but also please explain to me, persuade me, about how this works. Because as I was listening to you talk about your work, I was also just trying to think about how I might approach a similar question or a similar issue. And so, for example, if we routinely, what's my responsibility? Let's say if I'm an editor writing a headline. So, man assaults woman. It can go with a headline that says man assaults woman, or in the Indian context, it could have other specificities with regards to the identity of the people involved. So it could be man of upper caste community assaults woman from oppressed caste community. So what is my responsibility there when I am, casting the story, casting the headline, or let's say deploying somebody, or deploying or going myself to do a future or a follow-up story. So what I'm trying to understand is whether it is meaningful or meaningful at all or sufficient to explain violence against women with this class, labor, capital and market heavy or market first kind of point of view. Because I think, there are various questions we can ask, and as a reporter, various ways in which I can do a story. So, for example, the government some states have brought in law on prohibition. So, is prohibition of alcohol something that is going to increase or decrease violence against women? There are Khap panchayats which will say dress a certain way because that's likely to increase or decrease your chances of being assaulted by a man. The death penalty, whether the death penalty is going to increase or decrease your chance of being assaulted, whether a new law on acid attacks is going to increase or decrease. And I think in all of these situations what we're seeing is, while we think that ensuring that people are gainfully and satisfactorily employed, or ensuring that there's a heavy punishment to pay if you assault a woman, what we see is also that it does not necessarily need to play out this way, because I think focusing on any one of these things, which in this case is employment and labor, and in the situation of prohibition or acid attacks or any of these other configurations, there's a sort of tendency for us to focus on one of these things, which may not sufficiently explain why there is actually violence in our society. So I think I'm just trying to understand, because I think your own research says that we have a situation where when men are likely to be unemployed, there's an increase in the chances of violence against women. But in the same situation, there are also situations where men who are unemployed may not be assaulting the women they're in intimate situations with or intimate relations with. There's also the situation of whether women are employed or unemployed, we simply don't have enough to tell us that unemployment is a trigger for women to be violent. So clearly there's something else here besides your class, labor, employment and market perspectives that, it's not necessarily that the presence or absence of a job will lead to or trigger some sort of violence in this relation. So there's something specific about the social relation here, and I'm just wondering what the kind of academic perspective is on, whether, am I not understanding this, or is there a need to understand this power relation and the violence that manifests from this power relation in a way that, is it necessary or urgent or required to factor in other kind of social and power equations, or is there a good reason why we should have a class, labor, market first kind of approach? So that's, I think, my, kind of like the thought that I've been struggling with, and I'd really just like to understand. Because I think, to make a comment specifically on the role of employment, sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, I think we've had a certain narrative and a certain rigid idea when it comes to understanding violence against women, which is that we expect men of a certain type to grab women of a certain type and then violently assault them. But I think what we've been seeing, what we've always known, but what we've been seeing overtly play out, at least since 2017 with Me Too, is that oftentimes, Harvey Weinstein wasn't unemployed at all, and the women that he was assaulting were women that he knew in intimate situations. He was not grabbing drunk women in a bar and assaulting them. So it's, should our perspective be that let's ensure that men are employed because that might actually lead to a situation where we might have less assault on women? Or is there something specific to the nature of maleness, masculinity, and that social relation between men and women that gives us a situation? So I think, I also did go through a 2018 paper that you'd written, and I think in that paper there was some reference to this idea of the male backlash, but I think that was not maybe the priority of your paper, if I understood it correctly. And you'd also spoken about whether access to divorce is a factor that can perhaps empower women and put them in a stronger position. But I do see that the primary focus is really on class, labor, employment and market. So I guess that's what I'm trying to understand as a journalist. What is the most meaningful and thus also most accurate way to explain why there's violence? And is there a good reason why, within this methodology of work, there's such a class-first approach to it, and whether there is in this methodology of work any space for an intersection of understanding about how violence plays out, or is this methodology in some way so rigid that it will not lend itself to it? So I guess those are my thoughts, or rather mostly my questions.
Thank you, Anu. I'll give the floor to Professor Bhalotra to quickly discuss some of the issues that were raised.
Okay, thank you, Anu, for your comments. I don't think there's any important division between economists and journalists in general. I have worked a lot with journalists. I think it might be just a misunderstanding. Just for the economists who are in the room, everything I discussed is a marginal effect. It says, if unemployment changes, then what happens to domestic violence? If benefits change, what happens? There's no suggestion at all that unemployment is the most important factor or the only factor. Not even that it's most important. There was no horse race between different predictors. So the only sort of reason to focus on unemployment is that it was one research question. But I'm happy you asked, because it gives me an opportunity to tell you about a piece of work that's just starting in Brazil again because of my connections there, where we are doing something I think closer to your heart, which is working, so there's no economics, although I don't really think of this as labor or class, I just think of it as life. I think unemployment is one important source of poverty. So I think 20, 30 years ago, economists were taught about labor and class, but the undergraduate lectures today, they don't mention the language you use, so I don't actually even think that way. I think of unemployment as one source of poverty, and I have papers, for example, on property rights and everything that Indira said as other sources of poverty. Anyway, in Brazil, we have an explicit collaboration with the judiciary in the one state of Brasilia, and also with the Maria da Penha Institute, which is a big NGO. And we're going to run, it's a randomized controlled trial, which means that roughly half of a group of people who were randomly drawn, like which half we choose is random, but roughly half of a group will get an intervention, the other half won't get it, although for ethical reasons they will get it just later, so it's phased. Anyway, we're intervening on male perpetrators who've been charged but not convicted, and on their wives, and the treatment, inverted commas, the intervention for male perpetrators is a training program that actually the Brazilians already have in place, but it's never been evaluated. So our role is to slightly modify and modularize it so we can say which parts of the program maybe are more effective than others. But it's their own design because they know their own local needs. And similarly, the NGO, Maria Penha NGO, has designed a female empowerment program. And there's a session for 2 hours, women meet in a group, victims only. They have a whole other program for prevention. This is the program for victims because there's a lot of reoffending. And so not taking you through the whole thing, but for example, one session is on challenging gender norms, another session is on knowledge of support services, who you can call, the whole range of health, legal, and civic support services, just information and practical knowledge of access. And one thing we're adding has come from psychology. It's a sort of module called self-efficacy training. And psychologists have shown that individuals can be taught self-efficacy, which is just translating intention into action. So a woman might learn that she doesn't have to accept that the man is in control of spheres of her life, but she may not know with which language or with which energy to translate that intention into action. And it's not something we're experts at, but there's a module out there that's been tested for self-efficacy training. So here there is no market, there's no unemployment, and we're doing this. So I think we're all here to discuss an important issue, and maybe I should have clarified that the papers on unemployment just happen to be papers on unemployment. I have a different paper on property rights, a different paper on dowry laws, a different paper on these empowerment programs. So I don't actually think that unemployment is the most important or single factor in the equation.
Thank you, Professor Bhalotra. Thank you everyone for joining us for a wonderful discussion today. Since we're running short on time, I'd request everyone to take any questions and answers over high tea. There's snacks outside. Thank you everyone.